Thank you, Chairman Miller and the committee for holding this hearing today and inviting me to share my story. My name is Toni Price. I am a foster mother, and Cedric was my foster son. By the time Cedric came to my home at the age of 12, he had been through a lot in his short life. His parents neglected him and his siblings and abused them both physically and emotionally. They were underfed and food was withheld from them. Cedric, the oldest, used to rummage through food for himself and his siblings. He had scavenged through trash cans, and he was caught stealing food from a grocery store. He never knew when he had his next meal. Cedric became very sensitive about food. Starting at the age of 9, Cedric went to many foster homes, but struggled. After a number of unsuccessful placements, Cedric was sent to a boot camp facility north of Killeen, where he experienced more abuse. He had a permanent scar on his face from being beaten with a shovel by a boot camp supervisor. It was after that facility that he came to live with my family and me at the age of 12. Despite his experience, Cedric came in with me with a smile, and he was very jovial and truly a loving smile. He liked to bike, go bowling, and feed the ducks in the pond near our house. When he had extra energy, he loved to run to the end of the driveway and back. He got along well with the other children in the house, particularly my son, because he always wanted a big brother. They played a lot of basketball. I remember at church, Cedric wanted to be in a play, but there was no more parts for him. He got the biggest smile on his face and said, "I know a part," and when he stood on the stage, the director said, "Okay, you can play an angel." I knew he was sensitive about food, so I told him he could have anything in the kitchen, just let me know. Cedric had behavior problems, but they were never physical, and he was never aggressive. We were able to find solutions to his behavior that worked. Once he stole a bag of chips from the kitchen, I made him pay me back, and it worked because he learned his lesson about stealing. But it was a consequence that didn't bring any of the previous abuse up to the surface. His therapist asked him once to describe a place. His answer was in a cave with solid rock walls, a steel door, and lots of food. Even though he was well fed at my home, food was a trigger for Cedric from the trauma of his childhood. Cedric enrolled in public middle school. His first year in school, in 7th grade, he had no problems. I didn't get any phone calls, and he did well in school. His 8th grade year, with a different teacher, he would always say to me, "I don't think she likes me." I'd reassure him that she did. I got frequent calls from his teacher that year about verbal aggression, though I never got calls about physical aggression. I could ask the teacher to put Cedric on the phone and said, "Cedric, you know you need to do your work." He'd say, "Yes, ma'am." Sometimes Cedric would get in trouble at school for stealing food. But what I learned later was that in his classroom, he was being withheld food as a punishment for acting out. The morning of his death, Cedric was put on what the teacher called delayed lunch. Because he stopped working about 11 o'clock, this was apparent a common punishment for him. At 1 o'clock, Cedric got in more trouble when he still hadn't eaten lunch. He was caught trying to steal candy. At 2:30, he still hadn't been allowed to eat his lunch and got up to leave the classroom. After Cedric attempted to leave the classroom, he refused to sit back down in his chair, so the teacher forced him into his chair and restrained him. She is roughly 6 feet tall, weighs over 230 pounds. Cedric was short. He was a little boy. Cedric struggled as he was being held in a chair, so the teacher put him face down and sat on him. He struggled and said repeatedly, "I can't breathe. If you can talk, if you can speak, you can breathe," she snapped at him. Shortly after that, he stopped speaking, and he stopped struggling, and he stopped moving. The teacher continued to restrain him. Finally, the teacher Finally, the teacher and aides put Cedric back into his chair and wiped the drool from his mouth and set him up. But he slumped over and slipped out of the chair. Precious moments passed before a nurse was called. I received a call at work that Cedric was not breathing and an ambulance had been called. I rushed to the school, not completely clear what was going on and what was happening. When I got to the school, my son was laying on the floor with a paramedic beside him. I knelt down and said, "Cedric, get up. You're not going to be in trouble." But Cedric didn't move. Instead, the paramedic stood me up. My son was dead. I didn't know the school was practicing restraint techniques on Cedric. I didn't know they were withholding food as a punishment. In fact, when I initially enrolled him at the school, I told administration he'd been withheld food as a child, and it was traumatic. When the teacher was having trouble with Cedric, I told her about the techniques with helping him at home. I tried to help her because Cedric was not a bad kid. He'd come home, he had come so far and had so much success in the 7th grade. I knew that he could be successful. The school never held meetings with me to address behavior problems aside from calling his teacher. I didn't know the extent that Cedric was getting in trouble and what they were doing to him. This teacher took a child's life, but she also caused a lot of damage to the classmates, many of whom were victims of trauma already. His classmates and parents were forbidden to talk to me, but for many of the children, witnessing the abuse of Cedric was so traumatic for them that they spoke, and in turn, their parents spoke to me. After I read the autopsy report, I was taken about how much a school can get away with. Cedric's death was ruled a homicide. The school policy allowed therapeutic floor holds when a child is engaged himself and others, but Cedric wasn't endangering himself, anyone that day. No problems were found with the teacher's conduct. No legal action was taken, and as a foster mother, I didn't have the right to press charges. Eventually, a judge found the teacher's actions to be reckless and Cedric's death not an accident, but she never received a criminal record or any kind of sentence. She was placed on a Texas registry for being abusive to children. I have been told that this teacher now teaches at a public high school in Northern Virginia. Her Virginia license shows her accreditation to be kindergarten through 12th special education. If that teacher was just doing her job, then something is very wrong with the system. If I treated Cedric that way, I'd be in jail. I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else's child. It was awful the way Cedric died. He was a good kid. This should never happen. The morning Cedric died, he was boarding the bus. He turned around and got a beaming smile on his face and said to me, "Mom, you know I love you." Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Price.